Hey guys, welcome to part 2 in the Introduction to Airbrushing tutorial series. Before we jump into the actual painting stuff, I thought I'd cover a couple of different things. First, let's talk about the type of airbrush that I'm going to be using today. This is a gravity feed airbrush, meaning that you load paint into the top, gravity will pull the paint down and out the front as you let air through the brush. There are different types including siphon feed and side feed. I've never personally used these types of airbrushes myself, so I'm not incredibly familiar with their operation, but I imagine the general gist of how to spray and things, general operations will be pretty similar, as long as you're using a dual action airbrush. The next thing I want to talk about is air pressure. It's a very common question that I get a lot. A lot like the thinning question and other issues that I've covered so far, there's not really a right or wrong answer to this. I personally like to sit around 20 psi. I try not to go too much higher than that. Unless I'm doing something very detail oriented, I'll bring that down a good bit. But if you're looking at the pressure gauge right now, it says it's set to about 30, but once I press the airflow on the airbrush, it's going to quickly change to 20. That's what I'm actually spraying at, and this is what I want. Your air is always going to be set to what the gauge says it is while your air is flowing through your airbrush, so be sure that you check that out before you start spraying. Now, on to the priming stage. For primer, we're going to be using Mr. Surfacer 1000 Black instead of the white primer that we thinned down in the last video, simply because putting white primer on a white spoon is going to be very hard to demonstrate. When I prime, I layer each layer over each pass just a little bit more. You want to try and you'll make a pass, and then you'll want to overlap that layer just a little bit each time you make another pass, working your way down the piece. It might take 2 or 3 full passes or full coats to get the opacity that you're looking for, but you don't need a fully opaque layer of primer to proceed. It's fine if you can see a little bit of that color from underneath. It really depends on what you're trying to do. So for this example, I'm just going to make sure that the spoon is fully black. The next thing I'm going to do is just an example for you guys. I'm actually going to go ahead and blast the color or the primer all over this spoon just so that you guys can see. There's nothing really wrong with doing this. You're going to be getting a thicker layer of paint, so that's not really ideal. And it'll also take a little bit longer to dry, which means before you can start applying paint, you're going to need to wait a little bit longer to do that. So while we watch this spoon dry, let's go ahead, let's shout out a couple patrons. This month we have Andy, Gil, SD, Rex, Nick, and Adam. If you guys are interested in getting videos a week ahead of everyone else, as well as helping this channel grow, check out the links in the description. Next, I wanted to talk about spraying paints and how you can be sure that your paint is thinned properly. Now I'm using a fairly fine needled brush, which means the needle and the cone at the front of the brush are a little bit smaller than normal. meaning that paint needs to be thinner to pass through. For my first example here, I took the Tamiya paint straight out of the pot, loaded it into the brush, and tried to spray it. Now normally I would have assumed that this wouldn't have sprayed, but strangely enough it didn't have too many problems spraying. It was a little bit thicker than I would have liked, and it was a little bit more opaque than I would have liked, but it still sprayed. Now this doesn't mean that you shouldn't thin your paints down. Again, the more you thin your paints, the more mileage you're going to get out of your paints. That's a big thing. It's also going to lay down a smoother, nicer coat as you go. We're going to apply our paint the same way we applied our primer. We're going to overlap each one of those layers and build up that coat as best we can. It might take 2 or 3 passes, but we want to go ahead and do it that way. Now, like I said in the last section, if your paint is too thick, typically it's not going to spray out of your airbrush at all, or you'll shoot like little cobwebs of color onto the piece that you're spraying. In order to fix this, you just need to add a little bit more thinner to your paint, and you should be good to go. But test number 2, we're going to go ahead and we're going to use the properly thinned paint. This is going to show you the example of what your paint should be looking like when you spray it. Again, a couple of light coats, we're going to build that color up, and we're going to move on to the next one. Finally, we added a bunch of thinner to the already thinned down paints, and we sprayed it. Now again, this came out a lot better than I expected it to. I'm not sure if this was because I kind of knew what I was going for or not, but I couldn't get this to look like it was too thin. Usually you're going to get incredibly transparent looking layers, and you're going to get like runny effects if you spend too much time or you move too slowly. Again, if your paint's too thin, you're going to know. The easiest way to fix this is to either add more paint to your mix or to turn your pressure down to compensate for how thin your paint is. So now let's take everything that we've learned so far and apply it to actual pieces. And there you have it, the priming and base coating phases of painting. Everything you will do from here on out is an evolution of these techniques. Next time, I think that we're going to go ahead and go over shading. We're going to look at the difference between pre-shading and post-shading, the pros and cons of each one. We're going to talk about choosing the proper colors for shading, and just some other little things like that. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Thanks for watching. Bye.